Hello, and welcome to my presentation. This is training recovery with the primary focus on nutrition. My name is Dr. Tom Nesser, and I'm at Indiana State University. I've been involved with the CSCCA for a number of years, and I'm very happy to be doing this presentation for the virtual conference this year. My background is primarily exercise physiology with interest in strength and conditioning. All right, so let's go ahead and get things started. So like I mentioned, this is going to be training recovery, although I'm going to focus mostly on nutrition considerations. So about 90% is going to be nutrition, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of sleep and touch on heart rate variability. One thing that I say often with anybody, because there's always stress about creating that perfect training program, which everybody knows for the most part, there is no such thing as a perfect training program. But even though everybody will state one method versus another and its superiority and how well it might work, the important factor to any training program, none of it matters without recovery. All right? It doesn't matter how perfect the sequence, the sets, the reps, the frequency, none of it matters without recovery. Because if you don't have recovery, you don't get the adaptations. Nothing matters then. So that's what we're going to focus on is the recovery aspect, and again, specifically nutrition. So one thing I do want to mention, I think it's important to understand, because we are going to be talking about nutrition. Nutrition, like I said, it has a commonality with politics and religion. They're all belief systems, right? So you walk into any room and you can get into a political debate about anything, right? Anything. Is one right, one wrong? Not necessarily. It's what a person believes in. Religion is another great example. If a person might be religious, they might not be religious. If they are religious, what type of religion? Does it make one wrong and one right? Not necessarily. It's what they believe in. So nutrition is very much the same. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of debate related to nutrition. There is research available, but oftentimes people will stick to what they believe in, what they think works for increasing muscle mass, what works for decreasing fat mass. It all depends, it all varies. And it's all related to belief, what a person actually believes in. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I want to do is I'm going to review all the macronutrients and just some different considerations. So briefly, we're going to talk about carbohydrates, plants, and of course, carbohydrates are primarily come from plants. Plant-based carbohydrates is sugar. Sugar is a carbohydrate. There are some carbohydrate in dairy, which we'll get to, we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we're going to talk about fats. Of course, there are plant and animal sources when it comes to fats. We'll talk a little bit in a bit more detail in relation to saturated fats and unsaturated fats. And then proteins, of course, there are plant and animal sources for proteins, and some additional discussion related to complete proteins and incomplete proteins. So let's start with carbohydrates. Of course, carbohydrates, as I mentioned, are primarily plant-based. So this is a list of foods that are specifically carbohydrates. So your rice, potatoes, pasta, cereals and breads, anything made with a grain is a carbohydrate. Majority of baked goods, all right, they're made from flour, made from grain. Beans, legumes, uh, they're more of a combination of carbohydrate and protein, but they are still a carbohydrate source. And then, of course, sports drinks, gels, bars, um, candy, sugar. Those are all carbohydrate. So breaking down carbohydrates a little bit further, as I mentioned, they are sugar, and carbohydrates known as saccharides. So there are essentially three primary saccharides. They are monosaccharides, which is glucose, which we find is the basic sugar that our body uses to metabolize to generate ATP. There is fructose, which is sugar that is found primarily in fruits. And galactose, which is sugar found primarily in dairy products. Now, disaccharides are simply combinations of the monosaccharides. So sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose. And again, sucrose comes primarily from fruits, vegetables. Sucrose, of course, is processed, can be from cane, uh, sugar beets. Other products can be utilized to produce sugar. Sucrose, of course, very much along the same lines as high fructose corn syrup. It's that combination of glucose and fructose. The difference is sucrose is about a 50-50 ratio between fructose and sucrose, whereas corn syrup has a higher percentage of fructose. So you can have regular corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup. And again, it's basically the same glucose and fructose. It's just a slightly different ratio. Maltose makes up 2-glucose, and maltose is specifically your grain products. And then lactose is galactose and glucose, and lactose. Lactose is what you find in dairy products. Of course, then we have polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are simply more than two saccharides linked together. They are found either in fiber, which is fiber which typically is not digested, and then starch, which is common in potatoes, for example, are just a long string of saccharides. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the USDA recommendations for carbohydrate intake. So, and I've condensed it here a little bit. So of course, any fruit or 100% fruit juice, daily intake is 2 cups. Any vegetable or vegetable juice, 2.5 to 3 cups. And then of course, any food made from wheat, rice, oats, corn, barley, or other cereal product is considered a grain product, and then looking at 6 to 8 ounces of a grain daily. A few things on these. I struggle with the idea that 100% juice is considered a serving. I struggle because when you're drinking only the juice of a fruit or a vegetable, you might be getting some vitamins and minerals, maybe, but really all you're getting is the sugar. You're not getting any of the fiber, which is better for your body, better for digestion. And then grains itself. We'll talk a little bit more about grains in a minute. But one thing to note when it comes to grain, if you may have noticed, is corn. Corn is technically a grain, not a vegetable. So when you see a lot of products identified as whole grain, there's a good chance that it's been made from corn. So the label isn't lying. It is true. It is a whole grain product, but it is made from corn. And you see that corn is made, is considered a whole grain product. All right, so carbohydrate is broken down, basically broken down into glucose. So if it's sucrose, if it's maltose, if it's lactose, it is broken down into its components of glucose and possibly fructose. Now, glucose is the body's primary fuel source for energy to generate ATP. One thing that is important to note, whether you eat a bowl of rice or a bowl of Skittles, it's all sugar, all right? It's all glucose, combination of glucose or glucose and fructose. It's all metabolized the same. It's breaking it down into that basic component of glucose and releasing to the bloodstream. Now, fructose is not metabolized quite the same as glucose. Glucose, we'll talk about, goes through glycolysis. Fructose, on the other hand, is transported to the liver and is converted to fat. So one aspect of sugar intake, depending upon the type of sugar that a person is consuming, if it is higher in fructose, the individuals do run the risk of converting that fructose to fat in the liver, which has the potential, this is extreme, but has the potential of leading to fatty liver disease. Glucose, of course, is released into the bloodstream. And the rate at which a carbohydrate is broken down to glucose and released to the bloodstream, of course, is known as the glycemic index. The higher the glycemic index, the faster, of course, it is released to the bloodstream, and the higher and quicker individuals' blood glucose levels will rise. All right, so fructose mentions converted to fat in the liver. And then, of course, fiber is undigested. So a lot of fiber that we find in plant products, our body, we cannot metabolize it. So it simply just passes right through, which is not a problem. It's not a problem. It's actually good for our digestion. But again, it's fiber that our bodies we don't derive any energy from fiber. All right, so glycemic index, as mentioned, identifies a food as to how high and for how long it raises blood glucose. So typically a food like a soda, white bread, white rice, typically has a high glycemic index because it is very easy for your body to break it down into glucose, and it releases into the bloodstream very quickly. So foods such as white bread have a very high glycemic index value. Glycemic index value is typically on a scale of 0 to 100. Although you will see some scales that may go over 100, it all depends on how they tested the value of that food product and what was the gold standard, the measurement. Did they use glucose as a measurement, or did they use white bread as a measurement? All right, so again, foods digested quickly raise blood glucose, blood sugar rapidly. What is important to understand, high glycemic foods, they can play a role related to physical activity, but when not physically active, individuals are likely to also experience an increase in insulin. Because of course, insulin is released when blood glucose levels are above normal. So insulin is released to help transport and move the glucose from the blood to the tissue. And we'll talk more about that in a second. All right, foods that of course take longer to digest and thus slowly increase blood glucose will of course stimulate less insulin. They have a lower GI value. Foods that have a low GI, again, when an individual is not physically active, is recommended to help control and stabilize blood glucose levels and of course insulin levels. So let's talk a little bit more about insulin. Most individuals understand insulin. Of course, it's a hormone and it's released from the pancreas. Insulin is also known as a fuel storage hormone. So most notably about insulin is it helps to transport glucose from the blood to the tissue, specifically the muscle. As I mentioned, in relation to foods that are high glycemic, when there's a sudden rush of glucose into the blood, the body identifies it and will release a high level of insulin into the blood as well. The body inadvertently will release too much insulin, which will cause too much glucose to be pulled from the blood and put to the tissue. This happens, again, with your high glycemic foods, about 30 to 60 minutes after consumption of the soda or bagel, whatever maybe it was. Individuals will experience a sugar crash, otherwise known as reactive hypoglycemia. So 30 to 60 minutes after a high carbohydrate meal or beverage, individuals will feel tired, fatigued, lethargic, ready to lay down and take a nap. Well, their blood sugar levels have tanked. They are now hypoglycemic. And likely what they'll do is they'll crave something, sugar, and they'll grab something else to drink or eat, likely an energy drink or maybe a coffee, something along those lines. Unfortunately, they usually grab something else that's high in sugar, which then starts the cycle all over again with a dump of glucose into the bloodstream and then a further dump of insulin. And then the cycle continues throughout the day. So it is important during the day when not physically active, it is important to limit the amount of foods that are high glycemic. And then again, those are primarily your processed sugars and your processed carbohydrates, your grains. Again, your white breads, your white rices, baked goods, candy, that type of stuff. Now, one other thing about insulin that I do want to note, as I mentioned, high glycemic foods are not bad during physical activity, because during physical activity, insulin is not required to transport glucose from the blood to the tissue. All right, and that's important to understand because as we look at other roles of insulin, so it's important, insulin, again, not only does it transport glucose from the blood to the tissue, but it also transports amino acids from the blood to the tissue. That is important following training. The other aspect of insulin that most people don't understand or just never knew is that insulin inhibits lipolysis, meaning it stops the body from breaking down and metabolizing fat to use as a fuel source. So, as I mentioned, insulin is not necessary during physical activity, which is important because during physical activity, The body, of course, initially will start to use carbohydrate as a fuel source, but during prolonged activity, aerobic activity specifically, there's that crossover effect where the body will transition from using primarily carbohydrate as a fuel source to using primarily fat. If insulin is still found in the bloodstream, the body cannot transition to using fat as a fuel source. So it is most important that insulin, the requirement of insulin to transport glucose from the blood to the tissue is eliminated and it goes away. This is what will allow the body to metabolize fat as a fuel during physical activity. And this is very important. It's vital that the body can metabolize fat during physical activity, specifically during the prolonged aerobic activity. So another aspect of insulin is it also prevents the liver from releasing glucose back into the bloodstream. As we know, one difference, a main difference with the storage of glucose in the muscle and glucose in the liver. Glucose in the form of glycogen in the muscle, once it's there, it's locked in. It cannot be re-released to the bloodstream. Glucose stored as glycogen in the liver can be converted back to glucose and re-released into the bloodstream to be used in the body where necessary. So that's a big difference. So insulin, when present, will prevent the liver from releasing glucose back into the bloodstream. So again, it's during physical activity, it's very important that insulin levels are low. So carbohydrate inactivity, as I mentioned, the primary fuel source in the form of carbohydrate is glucose. Glucose is initially metabolized through glycolysis, which is an anaerobic energy system. Oxygen is not required for glycolysis to function. Of course, the next step is the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, which is found in the mitochondria. The Krebs cycle is dependent on oxygen. It's part of the oxidative energy system, which the second portion of the oxidative energy system, of course, is the electron transport chain, which is also found in the mitochondria. So those two systems both require oxygen to continue to function properly. Glycolysis, as I mentioned, it is specifically anaerobic. However, if sufficient oxygen is not available and the oxidative system is unable to function, then glycolysis is limited in its capacity to run specifically anaerobically. All right, so let's transfer now and talk a little bit about lipids. So lipids, fats, come in a few different forms. Specifically, we have monounsaturated fats. Basically, they are carbon chains that have one double bond. Common monounsaturated fats are your olive oil, avocado, nuts will have unsaturated fats, and canola oil. Polyunsaturated fats contain two or more double bonds, and they are found primarily in corn oil, soybean oil, flaxseed, your standard vegetable oil. Polyunsaturated fats, your monounsaturated fats are most commonly used for cooking. One thing to be aware of when it comes to polyunsaturated fats, granted, they are very common. It is recommended that they are used for cooking and as part of your diet. But polyunsaturated fats, the processing, it involves chemical extraction and a lot of heat in the processing. So unfortunately, by the time you get corn oil or soybean oil from the grain or the bean. The product itself is it's a really low quality product. Ideally, if you want to use any unsaturated fats, your best bet is olive oil. And ideally, you want to use a extra virgin cold press olive oil. That ensures it's high quality and you're getting the greatest amount of nutrition from your olive oil. Other fats, your saturated fats, which each carbon is fully bonded to hydrogen. Saturated fats are, of course, solid at room temperature. Common saturated fats are butter, lard. And those are primarily butter and lard, of course, animal-based. Plant-based saturated fats are your coconut oil and palm kernel oil. One thing to understand with saturated fats, they've gotten a bad name over the years. Truth be told, saturated fats are not unhealthy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Next, the last one, of course, is trans fats. These are fats that start out as vegetable oils, and then they are hydrogenated, meaning hydrogen is added to the carbon chains, making them saturated at room temperature. Saturated trans fats are your margarines, a lot of your shelf-stable peanut butters, and shortenings, your vegetable shortenings. Trans fats are the one type of fat that need to be avoided. Those are your saturated fats that really need to be avoided. They're man-made, and your body cannot process them efficiently. So they are more likely to lead to additional health risks than your natural saturated fats. USDA recommendation for oil intake. Of course, the USDA recommends vegetable oils 6 to 7 teaspoons a day. 6 to 7 teaspoons is not a lot. So the use of vegetable oils, if you're using vegetable oils with cooking, which vegetable oils are recommended for cooking, it doesn't take a lot because a lot of that food will absorb that oil. So it'd be very simple to get 6 to 7 teaspoons of oil as far as the USDA recommendations. Now, the other recommendations suggest that fats should not consist of more than 30% of an individual's total caloric intake. And it's really 30% or less. And along with those, saturated fats should not be more than 10% of your total caloric intake. Again, saturated fats, as I mentioned, include coconut oil and palm kernel oil, which we'll come back to, are essentially healthy. They're good fats. All right, dietary fats. It's important to understand that fat is important for the diet, for good health, proper metabolism and function of the human body. Fat is a dense energy source, and fat is metabolized primarily through beta oxidation. So essentially it's the same process, for the most part, it's the same process as glucose, whereas glucose goes through glycolysis before it enters the Krebs cycle. Fat goes through the beta oxidation and then enters the Krebs cycle and oxidative energy system, just like carbohydrates. The difference, of course, of fat can only be metabolized in the oxidative energy system. All right, oxygen must be present for the metabolism of fat. Dietary fat is a source for essential fatty acids, and fat is necessary for the transport of fat-soluble vitamins. So fat in the diet is vital for good health. So one aspect about fat and consumption that it is important to understand, and this is where some of the dietary recommendations are off a bit. So vegetable oils, soybean, corn, is high in linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. Omega-3 fatty acid is alpha linolenic acid, and these are fats that are found primarily in fish, seafood. Omega-3 fat is identified as being important for health. All right, you don't hear a lot about omega-6 because the typical American diet is very high in vegetable fat and vegetable oil, because a lot of cooking, particularly foods that are deep fried, are cooked in vegetable oil. So individuals on a typical American diet, if they consume your fried foods, they're consuming a high level of vegetable oils. So they have these higher omega-6 in relation to omega-3. So ideally, an individual's diet should have anywhere from a 4:1 to a 1:1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio for good health. Typical American diet is an omega-6 ratio of 20:1. That's too high. And it has been, it's believed that this high ratio can be linked to health disorders along the line of gallstones. So what is most important is the idea that individuals will have a fear of eating fat. And a lot of it primarily stems from the USDA guidelines suggesting that an individual's caloric intake, fat intake, should be no more than 30% of their total caloric intake. So, and it reads 30% or less. Unfortunately, individuals will look at this and think, well, if going over 30 is bad, and it's better to be less than 30, then maybe I should try to eat as little fat as possible and ideally go on a low fat, zero fat diet. That is wrong. That is a big mistake. Individuals need to not worry about the fat in their diet. Now, the type of fat is important, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. So individuals can develop basically what's known as a fat phobia. They have a fear of eating fat. So they try to go with everything low fat. Low fat diets do not work. Fat is necessary for good health. And it is very important to understand eating fat will not make you fat. Fat does not lead to weight gain. What leads to weight gain is sugar, excessive carbohydrate intake. That is what can lead to weight gain, associated with the insulin release and the insulin's capacity to inhibit fat metabolism. Those are the important factors to understand here. So fat in the diet is vital to good health. So proteins. So talk a little bit about proteins. Of course, we have you have your meats, of course, animal-based, your dairy, legumes, nuts, and plants. Of course, your plant-based plants do contain proteins. Protein, of course, is vital for growth and repair of tissues. So the muscle, connective tissue, internal organs are protein based. And protein, of course, is important in the diet for anybody that is physically active. So anyone that does a lot of training, a lot of physical activity, a lot of exercise, need to have protein in their diet so there is a sufficient amount of amino acids so that the body can repair itself. And essentially that's what we're talking about here is recovery. If we don't have recovery, the body can't repair itself, and all training is for naught. So protein is vital for an individual's diet. Now, how much depends on your source, depends on who you talk to. Not getting into how much an individual should consume, but we will look at various components of protein itself. So as we mentioned, protein has both animal sources and plant sources. Animal proteins are complete proteins, meaning they contain all essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are amino acids your body cannot manufacture. They must be taken in as part of your diet. Non-essential amino acids, if your body for whatever reason is deficient, it can produce. So non-essential amino acids as being part of your diet is not a factor. It doesn't matter. If your body needs it, the body will manufacture what it needs. Essential amino acids must be part of your diet. And animal proteins will provide all of those amino acids, essential amino acids. Now, one thing in addition with animal proteins have a 90% absorption rate or better. So if you consume chicken, fish, eggs actually have a near 100% absorption rate. Majority of the protein your body will absorb and use it. Anything that the body cannot absorb, it will eliminate. So that brings us to plant proteins. Now, plant proteins are incomplete proteins. All right, there are a few exceptions out there, but for the majority, all plant proteins are incomplete proteins, meaning they are missing at least one essential amino acid. Now, typically it's not a big deal. Two plant proteins can compensate for each other. So in the proper combination, two plant proteins can become a complete protein. The bigger issue with plant proteins is their digestibility. Plant proteins have anywhere from a 45% to an 80% digestibility rate, meaning majority of the protein or a good portion of the protein your body doesn't absorb and it's simply excreted. So yes, plants do have protein, but they are a lower quality protein and your body is challenged to absorb and utilize the proteins that come from plants. All right, so two other factors just to identify when it comes to protein intake. Like I said, how much protein should an individual consume on a daily basis? That's up to discussion. And again, this is part of nutrition where people have their own belief. Some people suggest that the RDA recommendation of 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight is fine. Others will suggest that 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight is where the athlete should focus. Um, Protein intake, 3 grams per kilogram body weight or above is pretty much a waste because your body can only absorb so much protein. So when we look at the body's absorption rate, at any given time, the body can only consume 0.25 grams per kilogram body weight at any given time. So if an individual, for example, is required to take in 60 kilograms, 60 grams of protein, they're better off splitting it up into 3 meals with 20 grams of protein each, rather than eating 60 grams of protein all at one time. Again, so your body cannot absorb high doses of protein. They need to be spread out throughout the day. And then another factor associated with protein intake is for those individuals that are looking for the muscle growth, it is recommended to consume 0.5 grams of casein protein for every kilogram body weight right before going to bed. Because that's the importance prior to sleep. Having that protein snack will provide your body the extra amino acids when it repairs itself that the body needs, so that it has everything necessary to build and repair the tissue damage that occurred that day. What's important for strict vegetarians, vegetarians have to plan their diet carefully to ensure that they are intake all essential amino acids. Also, individuals that rely on plant proteins for the protein source need to likely double the protein intake from plants because of the poor absorption rate. So if you are consuming a plant product that you can only absorb 50% and you're consuming 2 grams per kilogram body weight, then you're gonna have to double it to 4 grams per kilogram body weight so that your body will actually absorb all of that protein that it needs to repair and grow. All right, just going to touch a little bit on hydration. Hydration, of course, is important for recovery as well, for good health, and basically strive for fluid balance. So replacing what is lost. So euhydration is normal body water content, and fluid replacement can be from various fluids, drinks, water, coffee, soda, etc., and from foods, whole fruits and vegetables, ideally. However, it is important to note that fluids, a lot of foods, you want to make sure that the sugar content is low or ideally sugar-free. Even artificial sweetener-free would be a good idea. All right, so post-training, this is really the importance of the nutrition component. After training has stopped, that's when recovery begins. So immediately after training, a food intake is recommended. Now, ideally, a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio is recommended, and this is something that can be consumed during training itself. There is an optimal 2-hour window post-training to consume the carbohydrate proteins. This is a situation when a higher glycemic carbohydrate can be valuable because it helps to move the carbohydrate and the amino acids rapidly from the blood to the tissue. After the 2-hour window, the need for high glycemic food has been eliminated. So any carbohydrate after that, those initial 2 hours should be lower glycemic, slow releasing carbohydrates. And again, not only carbohydrate, but protein after, because again, protein is necessary, and protein, amino acids actually will assist to transport the carbohydrate into the tissue and help with the recovery process so that it will begin as soon as possible. All right, so now a little bit more information. When we talk about food, you need to take in consideration the food sources and where it's coming from. This is vital when it comes to recovery. Nutrition is necessary, but the source of the nutrition is absolutely vital. Nobody is going to build a new house with sub-quality material. So why train? Why sweat? Why work hard only to recover with a diet of high sugar, poor protein, fast food, junk food, poor material? Why give your body poor material to work with when it's trying to build and repair itself? So it's vital that the food sources are high quality. So any fruits and vegetables, ideally organic, if possible, locally grown. And the best time to consume these fruits and vegetables is when they are at their peak. And the best thing is when they're at their peak is when they are the lowest price. But again, you want to go locally when possible so that you can limit the transportation, and there's less likelihood of pesticides used. And again, it's going to be organic. Grains as well. The one thing that's taken into consideration with grains, our bodies struggle to metabolize grains in their whole form. So to increase the breakdown of grains, they are processed. So they're ground up into a flour. The problem, of course, with that, once they're ground up into a flour, your body is able to metabolize and absorb them very quickly. And again, keep in mind, grains are made up of 2-glucose, and they can cause a blood sugar spike to occur rapidly. So grains can have a very high glycemic index. So the type of grain that an individual selects is important as well. And if you go with the process, or if you go with more in a whole grain, minimally processed. Dairy, ideally, dairy should not be low fat. Dairy should be whole fat, and if available, from pasture-raised animals. So the animal, again, locally, ideally, they're out in the pasture, they're out consuming grass like they're supposed to. And again, these products are going to be much healthier. Meats as well should come from pasture-raised animals. Majority of meats that you find in grocery stores come from feedlots. Feedlot animals are not well taken care of, and the quality of the product is not as good. So again, if possible, animals should come from a local source that is, they are pasture raised. They're not given a corn-based diet. Fats, as I mentioned, saturated fats are healthy. Saturated fats are okay to be part of the diet. Ideally, the saturated fats should be coming from pasture-raised animals. Animals that are, again, come from feedlots, the quality is low. And the fat, the butter that comes from these animals are a lower quality. So ideally, your dairy, your butter, your fat, the protein sources, the meat, ideally should come from pasture-raised animals because the nutritional value is much, much greater. And I want to touch on as well, briefly, on whole foods and ground foods, as well as raw and cooked foods. Cooking foods increases the absorption rate of nutrition. It helps with the digestion, as well as ground foods and chopped up foods increase the digestibility as well. So when possible, and ideally, cook your food, even your vegetables. Cook your vegetables. Uh, Ideally, don't boil them to death. Just cook them in a pan, saute them, put them in a soup or a stew or something like that. But your body can digest cooked foods greater than raw foods, as well as foods that are already chopped up. So, for example, hamburger, your body can absorb more hamburger protein than you can from a steak because it's ground up and it's easier for your body to finish digesting the product. All right, sleep considerations. So I'm going to go through this fairly quick. Sleep is absolutely vital for rehabilitation. Sleep is when your body releases the highest level of growth hormone. Now, ideally, quality sleep involves 8 to 10 hours of continuous sleep. The environment needs to be cool, dark, and comfortable. Ideal room temperature is anywhere from 60 to 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Consistent sleep and wake time, meaning that individuals need to go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time to put their body on a cycle. And as well as looking at circadian rhythm. The body, we sleep on 90-minute sleep cycles. So if you have a certain wake time, ideally count backwards in 90-minute cycles to determine when you should go to sleep so that you are not waking up in the middle of a sleep cycle. Ideally, you want to wake up at the end of a sleep cycle. That is when you will feel the most rested. There are sleep cycle apps that are now available that you can purchase for your phone, and it will monitor your sleep and wake you up when you are at the end of a sleep cycle. Other considerations. Now, early morning training, forcing individuals to get out of bed at 5 in the morning can, of course, interrupt their sleep. However, early morning training is not always something you can avoid. Avoiding screen time before going to sleep, phones, computers, anything with blue light. Avoid caffeine, avoid alcohol. That can all interfere with quality sleep. If an individual has a difficulty falling asleep, melatonin can be purchased over the counter. And if they fall asleep quickly but wake up in the middle of the night and then have a hard time falling back to sleep, that is an indication that they are overtrained. It's activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, and their cortisol levels are elevated. Other consideration for monitoring recovery is heart rate variability. This essentially what you're looking at is the variability between the R waves, and it's an indication of stress on the body. Heart rate variability is associated with a lower heart rate. So a lower heart rate, higher variability is an indication of greater adaptability and recovery. Typically measured before getting out of bed, and ideally this is completed with a heart rate monitor. And again, there are phone apps that can do this. The scale is 0 to 100. A low score indicates high stress and poor recovery from previous training, and it could be an indication that the individual is overreaching and potentially overtrained. High scores indicate low stress and good recovery. And again, heart rate monitor and a heart rate variability app is available. Okay, that is it. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions, you are more than happy. I'm more than happy to address any questions, any comments, anything you wish to share. Again, my email address is available as well as my phone number. So again, thank you again, and here's a list of a few of my references.